Good morning, teachers and my beautiful candidates, especially you, the candidates, because this is the time when you really have to make us proud and we want to be number one again. Hope the results will be as we expect them. My name is Palesa Boy, the subject advisor in the Harib district, doing economics as well as accounting. Thank you. I hope we'll have a productive session today. Right, what we'll be busy with today will actually be economics paper 1, trying to prepare ourselves, and the preparatory examination that you'll be writing is actually going to indicate to you already the results that you will get. Hope you do very well. Let us look then at the economics paper 1. First, let us look at the resources that you will need in order to be fully prepared for this examination, especially the final examination. You need to have known in the examination guideline, especially the use of the examination guideline by your teachers, that you must be able to tell how much content you must do. We talk of the depth and the breadth, which sections of the content more or less will be examinable as essays, or in section B, or as objective questions in section 1. Right, and then the diagnostic reports. I would prefer if you use the diagnostic reports of as many years as it is possible, especially the ones far back, as the paper would be maybe assessing questions that have not been assessed in the previous year. Right, and the moderator's report the same. And then the exemplar paper as we have it, and more so because this would be the first time where we write paper 1 and paper 2, as we have been writing one paper, as you all know. Right, the previous papers, but the use of previous papers also must be used with caution. When you prepare for paper 1, then you must use only those questions that are relevant for paper 1 so that you don't waste your time or get confused. The Mind the Gap, the ICTI's presentations, mindset presentations, as well as your textbooks and other resources that you will need in order to be fully prepared for the forthcoming examination. Right, let us now then look at the content covered in paper 1. As you know, like in paper 2, we'll have 150 marks and the paper will be for 1.5 hours. And the topics that are assessed in paper 1 will be just the macroeconomics as well as the economic pursuits. And when you look at the macroeconomics, the secular flow, the business cycle, the public sector, the foreign exchange market, as well as protectionism and free trade will be assessed. And then for economic pursuits will then be the growth and development, the industrial development policies, as well as economic and social performance indicators. It is important to be aware of these topics so that you don't get confused as you write the different papers. Right, the paper structure we have already said is 150, it's 1.5 hours. And the paper will have 6 questions, very important, as you will only have to answer 4 of the questions. And the paper is divided into 3 sections, as you know. The first section being that of the compulsory one, where we have mainly where the objective answers to be given. And then we have the section B, where it will be question 2 to question 4. You only have to answer 2 of the questions. In section C, it will be 2 questions, 5 and 6, and then you only have to answer 1 question. Very important, you need to know the structure, because if you answer more than the required number of questions, only the first response will be taken into account, despite the fact that you may have the second response better answered than the first. That will be ignored, and only the number of required questions in the order you have written them will be taken into account. So that is very important that you take note of that. Right, if we look at the detailed requirements of each section in the question paper, you need to know that the multiple choice, you look at more or less how you approach your multiple choice further as we look at this presentation, where you'll have the 4 from the main topic and then it will be 16 marks of 2 each. And then we have the match column, and then also there you'll have a combination of the questions from the different topics. That will be 1 mark, and then it will just be 8. And then the identify the concept, the 3, then it will be 3 items per main topic. And I really want to emphasize that although learners, you do fairly well in this section, but it is the 1.3 question that is very problematic, where you are not doing well. And this has not been assessed in the same manner as it was assessed before. Remember, in the past, you used to be given the choice where you take the answers from. But with this, now you have to, on your own, remember the concept that is being described by the different questions. Right, let us look at section B of the paper then. In section B, you'll realize that you have 2.1 is that will be the same for question 3 and question 4, so I will not repeat that again. So here we have the lower order questions like name this and that, and then you have the middle order where you have to discuss, only a short discussion. And then there will be a data response question. And here you have to look at the cartoon or the table or an extract, and then you answer the questions. This section is also very poorly performed. Learners perform very poorly on this section, mainly because they do not comprehend or are not looking at the what I call indicators on, say, cartoon itself, in order to be able to say what is it that they understand with the cartoon that is placed before them. And it is therefore very important that to look at the cartoon and see at the telltales what the cartoon is the message is trying to convey, so that you are able to respond to that, as well as the other questions that follow thereafter. Right, after the data response, then we will have one single question for 8 marks, and these questions normally you'll have discuss, compare, draw a graph, and so on. And learners really need to consult, or the teachers should have indicated to you more or less which of the questions as indicated in your examination guideline are likely to be assessed in this question. Right, and then the last section will therefore be section C, where we look at the essay. I know I said to you, you must look at the previous question papers, but as you look at the previous question papers, there won't be too much of change in any case of the content that will be assessed there. But their mark allocation would be different, as we are now working with a 40-mark total and no longer a 50-mark total, and there's also no grid anymore. And therefore, learners need to be very aware that as they answer this section, there must be an introduction, there must be the main part. Fortunately, this question is structured as such that there's a bullet for the main section, and then there's always, hopefully there will be a bullet for the additional part that you have to respond to. And the additional part, sometimes they want you to give an opinion or do an evaluation. It's more of where you have to give the response in the manner in which you understand things, either practically also. As you can see, the verbs that are used there: deduce, calculate, explain, give your own opinion, and so on. Those are the verbs that are likely to be used in order for you to respond to that question. And very important then, the conclusion. Right, as you do your introduction, remember to look at things like explaining and giving an explanation of the concepts that are mainly part of the topic that you are going to discuss in your main body. I will not prolong my presentation on this one, but more or less the questions that you'll have questions that are lower order questions, like the ones that you can find in the section A or section B, where I said you can name, discuss, and the name. And then you have the middle order questions, where you have those your 8 marks questions and so on. And then you have your higher order questions, where you really need to apply the according to the Bloom's taxonomy, the higher thinking. Right, now that we have talked about the structure, we can look at the content that needs to be looked at, which I think for you, this is the crux of your need. Paper 1 content. Like we have already said, macroeconomics, those are the sections. Economic pursuits, those are the, this is the content that you need to know for the different main topics. Right, like I said that you need to consult with your examination guideline. Let us look at some of the possible questions where you can be assessed with essays. If you look at the examination guideline, which I have now put on the slide for you, is we have the in-depth discussion of the interrelationship between the participants. Right, if you look at this question, in November 2008, this question was there, and in some other papers which I have not really looked at. Now, when you look at this, you need to not only discuss the participants. You know, you have your household, you have your business, you have your government, you have your foreign sector. And when you have those, you don't discuss them individually. You have to show the relationship. And when we mark this, we are trying to see, do we see that you understand how does the household, for an example, relate to the business sector? I need to see that you have shown me that the household, as he possesses the factors of production, he is selling, or they're selling the factors of production to the business. I need to see the relation that the business is selling the goods and services that he has produced, for an example, to the household and so on. So that relationship needs to be there for you in order to obtain marks. And when you look at, for an example, I think it was a diagnostic report in 2011 where 2.6 was also on this question, although it was a short question of about, I think, 16 marks, where the relationship was to be shown. So this is one of the very important questions that you need to know. Right, and then the discussion of the economy equilibrium. This is also another question that you are really supposed to know, my learners. Right, let's go to another question. Okay, with the circular flow, I want us to go back to the hot questions. I really believe that you need to go and look at the hot questions. What does hot question mean? I think it means therefore that these are questions that are likely to be there in a question paper. So you need to go and go through all the hot questions, see if you have the responses for the hot questions. And another way to do this would be to look at the hot question, go to the previous papers, see how this question was assessed in the different papers. Here's one of the hot questions that are said to be for the circular flow. How is the expenditure related to income and related to production? So it means here, therefore, you need to know that expenditure is equal to income, it's equal to production, and you need to try and see if you can show that with your aggregates. Right. Another hot question on this section, as per our examination guideline, is explain the multiplier process by using the graph and the following formula. Right, if you remember this, we also have a number of questions, although I have not looked at this, where you need to be able to draw the graph and show your income, show the relationship between your income and your expenditure, show that line, you remember, where you say this side is equal to that side, what is autonomous expenditure, and all those. Although we cannot do that now because we will not have enough time, but more or less I've given you an idea which graphs we are referring to on this hot question, or what is referred to by the examination guideline. Let's look at another hot question. What is the effect of marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save on the multiplier? I would advise you as well as the teachers, when you try to look at this, first, of course, you need to know what the multiplier is. And after knowing what the multiplier is, then you can use the formula. Say, for an example, when you try and do the marginal propensity to consume, use, say, a certain percentage, say at 20%, and use another percentage at 40%. Then it gives you the value of the multiplier. And when you do the marginal propensity to save, you do the same. And when you use the different figures, I realized that when I work with the learners and I use different rates of, say, consumption in the case of MPC or savings in the case of MPS, then the learners it's easier for them to understand why is the multiplier increasing or why is the multiplier decreasing. This then makes it easier for them to remember it for longer, because then that will not be just relating it like a parrot without understanding it, where they will say increase in leakage, the lower the multiplier and the smaller the impact on the initial change in spending on the level of output and income. Then they don't understand what they're talking about until you use exact figures so that they can see here is the level of the multiplier now. If I use another percentage which is higher or lower, here is the value of the multiplier. It therefore means this. Right, hot question, why is the value of the multiplier in reality a small figure? That's one of the questions also in the circular flow. I think we must now go to the business cycle. We have to cover all the topics. Therefore, we'll just quickly brush through all the topics. The business cycle. Right, the business cycle, the possible essays there, you have an in-depth discussion is required where you have to define, explain the nature of business cycle, be able to draw the graphs, use the diagram, and discuss the different phases in the business cycle. This question is also a question that is likely to appear in your 8 marks questions, but remember this, all the content may be there in section A and B. Discuss the monetarist as well as Keynesian approaches. This question, if I remember very well, it's a very popular question that appears in most of the question papers. And then in the diagnostic report of, I also looked at very old diagnostic reports just to see what was said in the other diagnostic reports except that one of last year. The learners here would normally confuse, say if they are supposed to discuss endogenous factors, then they go to exogenous factors and so on. And I would advise that when you do this, it is better to have this in a table form and then write the points like, okay, this is the monetarist approach. This is the Keynesian approach. For an example, say, in the monetarist approach, factors are not inherent in the market system. Say, for an example, go to the Keynesian approach and say the factors that are inherent in a market system and so on. The other factors, say, these are external factors, these are internal factors, and so on. And if they put their content that way, for them it's easier to remember them. If they have to compare, then they can easily compare. But if they have to discuss the other one, they can always remember that these ones belong to the exogenous or exogenous explanations, and these are either endogenous or endogenous explanation. Right, and then we have another question that is likely to be an 8-mark question, discuss the demand and supply policies with the graph. This can also be an essay type of question. Then they need to know the demand side and the supply side policies as well as make use of the graphs. Right, the hot questions in business cycles. The hot questions we have there: compare and contrast endogenous and exogenous explanations of business cycles. I will not go back to that. I have already alluded to how to approach that and how to practice for examination. The other hot question: explain how fiscal and monetary policy might be used to stimulate economic activities during the recession. Right. That also, they need to know about the monetary policy as well as the economic fiscal policy. Where they need to know about fiscal policy is the approach from the government, where taxations are used and so on. Monetary policy, that is the tool used by the Reserve Bank and so on. That they can also make use of the table for them to remember easily the difference between the fiscal and the monetary policies, and how do they use them to stimulate the economic activity. Remember, when they stimulate economic activity, they are trying to increase growth. Right, another hot question in business cycles is explaining how the demand side and the supply side policies would be used. Okay, this I think we have in smoothing the business cycle. And then make use of the given, make use of a given real business cycle diagram, explain why it serves as a forecasting model. Remember, when we do the forecasting model, then they need to talk about the leading indicators, coincidence, and so on. But I need, when we are here, to say, learners need to take care to distinguish between indicators that are used in the economic pursuits as a topic and indicators as they use them in the business cycle. Right, public sector essays. Public sector possible essays would be, as per exam guideline, discuss in detail the problems of public sector provisioning, clearly show why each of these factors contributes to the public sector, poor public sector provisioning. As the learners deal with this, remember they need to clearly say these are the problems, and if they do not know the problems, they'll have difficulty in responding. They need to first have their mind map in terms of saying, okay, we talk public sector, what are the problems? We talk accountability, we talk efficiency, we talk assessing needs, pricing policy, parastatals, privatization. And then from each of the content that they have outlined, then they say accountability, this is what I need to discuss. Efficiency, this is what I need to discuss. And if they do it that way, then they cannot go wrong. They'll be able to answer the essay, and they will be able to answer the other sections as well. Right, discuss in detail the main objectives of the public sector in the economy. The same goes where they have to talk about the objectives such as economic growth, full employment, exchange rate, stability, price stability, economic equity. They need to not only name but be able to expand more on those. Right. And then they also have to be able to discuss. Whenever they see in detail, then they must know that this is a possible essay question. You need to know that, my learners, discuss in detail the effects of the fiscal public policy. And when they do that, they need to do the same, go to the effects of the public policy as income distribution, consumption, and the others, and then they need to further be able to elaborate. That is the approach when you look at your essays. Discuss the reasons for public failure. When they look at the reasons for public failure, they also have to talk about what is, and this question also is a question that they normally confuse it with the question about the, I think it is the one on the objectives and the problems with public sector provisioning. And therefore, they need to look at the three, try to remember which one falls under which. And this therefore says it should not be a last-minute preparation, because they are then not going to remember that the reasons for public failure is about the management failure, apathy, lack of motivation, bureaucracy, politicians, special interest, structural weaknesses, and so on. And it is not about accountability, efficiency, and so on, as those are problems of public sector provisioning. Analyze, evaluate effects within the South African context. That could also be a question, and this is likely to be the additional 10-mark question. Right, these are the hot questions. Illustrate the composition of the public sector by means of a diagram. And then assess the effectiveness of public sector in supplying the public goods. Hot question, identify and explain how social rights are embedded in the budgets. These are some of the questions that are likely to be additional in the question. Hot question again, write a proposal on how South African government can avoid public sector failure. Of course, in order for you to say how can South African government avoid public sector failure, you need to have known why are we saying the public sector is failing. So you need to have the reasons for public sector failure in your head as you try and solve the problem here. Right, I want to go to the next one as we have to exhaust this topic and go to the other topic. Let us look at the foreign exchange markets. When you look at the foreign exchange market, I tried to peruse through the guidelines, see if I can see an essay question. Your teachers will help me there to look for the essay question with you, but I've had difficulty in finding one. But there are a lot of questions where you can explain, like briefly discuss the exchange rate, briefly explain the concept, terms of trade, and so on. But I did not see anything that needed you to go into detail. That is why then I went to the hot questions like this one. It is often said that the balance of payment shows if a country is living within its means. Evaluate this statement with regard to each section in the balance of payment. So you go to the different sections of the balance of payment and then comment in terms of whether the country is living within its means. That is, you remember when we talk about the balance of payment, of course, we talk about either the deficit and the surplus. So as you look at the sections, are the imports exceeding the exports, which leads into trouble of deficit, or are we exporting more than we are importing? And a hot question, draw a fully labeled diagram and express equilibrium in foreign exchange market and predict the effect that changes in the underlying forces of supply and demand will have on the value of the currency. Right, this is one currency against the other, but illustrated in our graphs. Remember, those graphs are more or less like the demand and supply graphs, but here we are dealing with the currencies that are exchanged between the different countries. And usually we normally have that graph of the dollars and the rand. South Africa's BOP shows an overall deficit of 10 billion rand over 3 successive quarters this year. Assume the biggest problem appears to be the current account. How would you advise the governor of the Reserve Bank to reduce the deficit on the BOP? When you approach this question, first you need to look at the current account, look at the items that are in the current account. Remember the monetary approach to, what did I say? The monetary approach that is used by the Reserve Bank in order either to stimulate the economy. So in this case, what are you going to say? It must be relevant to current account, but also it must be relevant to the usage of the monetary policy in order to stimulate the economy. Right. Protection and the free trade essays them. We have discussed the export promotion in detail. Another question that we have discuss import substitution in detail. These are normally questions that are regularly there in most of your question papers. Like for an example, where you have to discuss the import substitution in detail. You can, I think I have that one somewhere where I wanted to refer you to the question paper, but I'm not sure where in the question paper. But what you need to do there as you discuss that question, you need to say, talk about the definition, talk about the reasons, and then explain, say, the methods. Maybe you give them disadvantages and you give the advantages. As well as when you talk about export promotion, you need to do the same, where you deal with the definition, the reasons, the methods, the advantages, and the disadvantages. And this, because these, remember now, they are essay questions. So you have to be very thorough as you discuss these questions. Right, and then discuss arguments in favor of protectionism in detail. That is also a likely essay type of question, where you have to give the definition, give the arguments in favor of protectionism, just such as industrial development. Industries must be mentioned there. You must be able to mention things like prevention of dumping, stable exchange rate of the balance of payment, and many others. And when I looked at this question, I also saw it was there in September 2013, September 2012, and I think also in November 2008. So you can actually use a lot of previous question papers for your revision. Discuss free trade in detail. Okay, that one is also another likely essay type of question, where you can talk about arguments in favor of free trade, because they say discuss the free trade in detail. And when you look at the free trade, then you can go to arguments in favor of free trade, such as specialization, economy of scale, choices, and innovation, and the others, like the improvement of international relations. Right, now we go to our second main topic, which is now our economic pursuits. Remember, in the past we had the four main topics, but now we are only taking the two main topics for this paper, which is the macro and now the economic pursuits as our next main topic. In this section, like we have already outlined, there's economic growth and development. And the likely essays that you can have there is the discuss the demand side approach in detail, and discuss the supply side also in detail, and discuss South African growth development policies also in detail. When you discuss the demand side approach, you need to remember that the main aspects that you are going to discuss there is your monetary policy as well as your fiscal policy. Right, when you look at the South Africa's approach, for an example, you need to talk about the interest rate changes, the open market transactions, the moral suasion, as well as when you talk to the fiscal policy in the South Africa approach, you need to talk about the progressive personal tax, wealth, cash benefits, natural benefits, and the others. Right, now the supply side approach. When you discuss the supply side approach, depending on what is being asked of you, if you are asked then to discuss the supply side approach only, that is where now you have to talk about the creation of growth. You need to talk about the South African approach, where you are going to deal, in this case, with the efficiency and effectiveness of markets, the business efficiency, and what are the costs of doing business. If you look at this topic, the hot questions critically analyze the use of demand and supply side policies in South Africa. Right, that is where now you bring in also your own understanding. This is also likely to be part of your additional section. Remember, this is an advice, but it's not a guarantee that these will appear as suggested. But this, however, gives you guidance in terms of more or less what to expect and how the questions could be structured. Right, another hot question then. Let's go to the other one. Analyze South Africa's growth and development plan in terms of growth and development objectives. The same here, you need to have the understanding of what is going on there, and then, only then, you can be able to address the growth and development objectives. And remember, you also need to be able to differentiate the growth and development. Right, the industrial development policies specifically now. Here we have questions that we have. Discuss South African development policies. Did I say this? Let me see. Okay, I have already dealt with that one. Let us look at the economic and social indicators. The economic and social indicators, remember when I talked about business cycle, I said these are the ones that you should please not confuse with the others. And when we look at the economic indicators, analyze the economic indicators in detail. This then says this is an essay question. Analyze the social indicators in detail. Remember, we can also be able to differentiate what exactly are economic indicators, what exactly are social indicators. If you are able to differentiate the two, you will not be confused where when you are asked to discuss social indicators, then you start discussing the economic indicators. For example, if you are supposed to discuss economic indicators, amongst other things that you need to include as your indicators, you need to talk about the inflation rate because you are referring to the economic indicators. You need to talk about the foreign trade, things like the terms of trade, the exchange rate. You need to talk about another indicator here, which is employment. And when you talk about the employment, you need somewhere to refer to your economically active population, your employment rate, your unemployment rate. You need to talk about your productivity, labor relations, remuneration for the different per worker. The interest rate, the repo rate, remember the repo rate, that rate at which the banks get their lending from the Reserve Bank, and then the money supply. Then when you have done that, you will have discussed the economic indicators. But if you are supposed to discuss the social indicators, do not go to the economic indicators, but be aware of what social indicators are. Because when we discuss the social indicators, then we deal with those things that specifically have to deal with the people, like the demographics. In the demographics, you need to talk about the population. You need to talk about how long people live, the life expectancy. You need to talk about nutrition and health, where you are supposed to talk about aspects affecting obesity, children mortality, access to clean water, and so on. You need to, as one of the indicators, also refer to education. When you talk about education, you also talk about the people in the education, like secondary schools and so on. How much percentage is being spent, like percentage public sector spending in education, because education will then be an indicator that you are specifically addressing. Also, the services could be one of the indicators. Housing and urbanization could be another indicator that you can discuss them. And then we will say you have now addressed the social indicators. So very important, know these are indicators, but we have economic ones, but we also have the social ones. And sometimes here this is likely to appear with you given some indicators, which will be as say a table in section B where you can answer questions on such. So you need to be able to either address this as an essay question or be able to also address it if it is asked in another form in the other sections. Hot questions on economic and social indicators. We have here propose five considerations when assessing the performance of the economy. Right, what things must you look at when you look at the performance of the economy? You need to look at things like, you need to do comparison, look at the performance, look at things like the purpose and so on. So you need to be able to specifically have certain wording from the curriculum that indicates to us that you understand what considerations must be taken into account when we look at how the economy is doing. Remember, performance of the economy will have to do with whether we are having growth or we are not having growth. And this reminds me of the fact that when the statistics was out, we were worried that we'll be in recession. Those are the things that you need to sort of think about also as to perhaps include in your responses, especially when you were doing business cycle. Identify the 5 social indicators that are used for international benchmarking and give an analysis of their importance. I think this is also another hot question that you can be able to expect when you deal with the international comparison, where you will be having to respond on things like globalization, international standards, aid and support, and others when you respond to this question. Right, I think more or less I tried to answer, or not answer really, summarize the questions that I think you need to have them in your pocket before you go to the examination. I want us to just look at now, when you answer your questions, what is it that you need to look at exactly? Remember we said section A is you have your multiple choice, you have your match, you have your one concept question. Amongst other things, when you answer the multiple choice questions, it's either you know the answer, and if you don't know the answer, I went through the diagnostic reports and moderators reports, and that was of great concern to me, and I had to come and talk to you about this, where if you have a multiple choice and then you don't know the answer and you leave a blank space, that is not acceptable. I really think that should not be happening, because at least there are possibilities in front of you. One of them is correct. You either guess or do something, but blank space is just a no-no. Right, let us look at what can you do to help yourself. In a case where you don't know the correct answer, then you have to do an elimination. Right, you can use any paper. For an example, here I said you must look at the 2013 paper. But even if you don't look at the 2013 or take any other paper where you have your multiple choice, the process will be the same. You look at the question paper and you know that the first part of the question is known as the stem. That is the one that it is important to analyze the stem carefully, because it contains the instructions. The stem says what is it that is required of you when you respond. what kind of answer are we expecting from you? So first highlight the important words or concept in that stem, or as it appears there. And then from that, then you say, okay, I realize perhaps this is what they want. Right, like I said, when you look at the multiple choice questions, you look at the stem. The stem is actually that phrasing of the question that you must complete in order to get a final response. Then after that, you then have to go on and check on the different responses that are given to you. And then from those, then either you know the answer or you do not know the answer. If you do not know the answer, remember, we use the eliminating of the wrong answers. Let me explain what we mean by eliminating of the wrong answers. If, say, for an example, you want to, the question is such that you need to say, what? You need to give a response on, say, the multiplier. But the other responses are closer because they are talking about savings, are talking about maybe consumption, or they are talking about spending. Then you say, but this one cannot be the answer because this is not giving me the final answer which the question is requesting. Then you say, no, it's not this one. Then you look at the other one. You also reason it in terms of what the stem requires of you. And you look at the response, you say, but this one also cannot be. Given 1, 2, 3, it cannot be the answer. Therefore, you remember you have the 3 choices, you say, therefore, this should be the answer. And that is how you get to the answer, and not a blank space. So what have you done? You did the elimination of the wrong answers by going through all the responses and saying, it is not this one, it is not this one, it is likely to be this one. That is another way in which you can actually try and get to the correct answer if you don't know the correct answer. Because these other ones are actually just called the distractors. Right, read and understand the question. Analyze the question to find out what is wanted. I'm summarizing the multiple choice approach. Read the question, read it again, establish the context, break up the question into different parts, and then identify the response, and then you know the response. And then, okay, now when this is also applicable, especially when you do your essays now. When you approach your essays, remember it is very important to plan your essay. First, you must have your introduction, brief statement of the content you are going to consider or related content, or you can give the definition of those main concepts of the topic there. And then plan your essay in such a way that you talk about your main body now, your factual content, place it in paragraphs or place it in sentences that are very clear that you are now discussing the second point. And then have your headings and subheadings. And if the question is such that you had to draw a diagram, you need to draw the appropriate diagram. And then do your conclusion. In your conclusion, you do your brief evaluation, you give your own opinion, you give your final judgment on the discussions you have done above. These are the things that you need to remember when you write an essay. You write your essay containing it's the idea, the group of ideas, like we have made an example when we are looking at the possible essays in your guideline. Right, include the diagram where appropriate, but don't simply draw the diagram. Refer to it and carefully explain it in full sentences. Right, with 2 parts question, make sure to allocate time effectively, because remember the part 1 contains more marks than part 2, but you still need to consider the response in terms of what is required in part 1 and what is also required in part 2. Right, consider breakdown of marks if given. It will be given most of the time, and then you need to practice your essay. As you practice your essay, remember the mind map, the main topic, what sections need you discuss there as we have done just a while ago, and then what aspects must you discuss under each subheading. If you do that often enough, practicing of essays actually helps you managing the whole paper, because once you have practiced a number of essays, some of the content will not necessarily be in the essay, but that content is likely to be there in your section A or section B if it is not in your essay. Right, before we come to the tips for success, I also want to talk about the data response questions. When you deal with the data response question, just make sure that you first look at if it's a picture, this is the picture, in which topic is the picture being assessed, and then look at the things that are telltales in that data response question. For an example, if the data response question, you have a certain minister there, then they have the name of that minister, or they have content related to the work of that minister, then more or less you know that this here, we are now dealing with this aspect of the content, and therefore my responses must be in relation to the topic that is being assessed. So understanding of the cartoons, understanding of your graphs, especially the cartoons, because those are the ones that normally you are unable to say, what do you make of the cartoon? It's very important that you must understand the cartoon as it would be applicable in economics. Right. Now let us lastly look at the tips for success. You need to draw a timetable, my beautiful learners, so that you are able to know which content you are doing and when, and more or less when will you be finished with that in terms of your examination timetable now. Use the resources as outlined earlier. You have a number of presentations on the different topics, either from the resources here of the IBP, ICTIs. You have other resources like Mind the Gap. You have other resources, all the resources that I've mentioned. Those will give you a perspective in terms of the different presentations by different people, the different ways, the different textbooks explain concepts, but also the use of resources will also give you an idea of how questions are asked, where sometimes you are asked to compare, you are asked to name, you are asked to give your opinion, and when you look at them also, how can you structure that 10-mark section of the question as it is assessed. Another thing that I think is very important for you to succeed in this September examination as well as in your final examination is to give yourselves timed activities. If you give yourselves timed activities, it says if you are not able to write the whole paper, but you are responding only to a section of the paper, then you need to respond within a given time. Say if you are doing only section A of that paper, you look at how much time is required for you to complete section A. Then you do the section A within that time. See if you can complete within the given time. If you can't, then it means you must practice over and over until you are able to manage your time, because that is also another factor that makes your performance not to be well. Not that you don't know the responses, but you did not respond to all the questions in the given time. And then also have your study buddies talk to each other and talk about the subject concerned. In this case, it must be economics. Right. Finally, I just want to say you will succeed if you work hard. The other way around, where you succeed before you work, is only when you look at the word in the dictionary. And I wish you well, and say if you prepare well and ask the right questions to the people who can help you, there's no doubt you'll make it. We are looking forward to being a #1 province again. And that is only possible through you, as you are the ones who are going to sit in that examination room for the different hours, for the different papers. Remember, I want you to pass all the papers and not only economics. Wishing you well, and only the best is good enough. Thank you.